Welcome to the Satluj TV News podcast. So in our series of podcasts, we focus heavily on the many issues that have affected the international Sikh community, often from a US and Canadian perspective. But of course, here in the UK, the Sikh community, numbering nearly 750,000 people, have formed one of the many cultural backbones of this country in recent decades. And unsurprisingly, the community here in the UK has been deeply affected by the serious ongoing issues currently threatening the peaceful existence of Sikhs across the diaspora. So, to talk about these issues, our guest today is a person who's dedicated his life and career fighting for the rights and interests of his community. A dedicated public servant, he's served over 30 years in the UK's National Audit Office, becoming the organisation's youngest director. He's also held several key positions as auditor across the European Union, and his career earned him an OBE awarded by Her Majesty the Queen herself in 2000. But outside of his public duties, he's been a passionate advocate for the rights of Sikhs, not just in the UK, but worldwide. He's acted as a spokesman for the Sikh Secretariat and the principal advisor of the Sikh Federation UK. That's an organisation which both fights to protect the rights of Sikhs in the UK, but also encourages them to participate more actively in mainstream politics. He was also a founding member of the Sikh Network that produced the highly acclaimed Sikh Manifesto. So Dabinderjit Singh, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Angus. Great to join Satluj Television.
Now, of course, there are several large topics I would like to discuss with you, and just for our viewers, I would highlight that this is hopefully the first of a series of interviews that we'll do with my guests, just to make sure we do each of these large topics sufficient justice. So, Dabinderjit, you, of course, as I mentioned in the intro, have had a lifetime of working, in effect, for the British state, and of course rewarded by your OBE. You've also spent a lifetime fighting for the rights and interests of the Sikh community. What is it that drives you? What is the energy that drives you, that gets you up in the morning to do this?
I think there's many facets to your question in terms of an answer. Firstly, I think for your viewers, it becomes abundantly clear when I speak that I speak very fluent English because I was born and bred up in the UK. And I think first and foremost, that's really important when we talk about some of the topics we're going to talk about, because being brought up and being born in this country has meant my thinking is very much based around the sorts of freedoms we enjoy in the UK and in Western nations. And it's very different to those that perhaps were born in the Indian subcontinent and come with almost this baggage of being almost second class or being treated badly. And I think that's partly the answer to your question. The other part is being a practicing Sikh, being fully practicing. I took my Amrit after I left university, but actually my parents brought me up as a Sikh from birth, so I've never cut my hair. So it wasn't that the events of 1984 changed to me and I became a Sikh. No, I was a Sikh before that. I was a practicing Sikh. And if you take those two things together, the teachings of our gurus, for Sikhs to be human rights champions, to stand up for people's rights, to talk for the well-being of all, then it's natural when our own people, our own nation, our own Qawm, these phrases get interchangeably used, when they are under threat, then it's absolutely right that people like myself don't necessarily think about their careers, the positions they've reached, but it's actually to enter that debate and change minds and change people's views about how they may misunderstand the Sikh community and our history and what we're trying to do.
And I think it's a very interesting common thread that I find talking with many people in the community. There is this core of passion, of belief that really drives the whole community. And it's very interesting because it does seem to come into contrast with an almost inherent mindset with many Indians of almost subjugation. And I think the Indian government seems to, they control India with, well, certainly at the moment, with a bit of a rod of iron. And they have also targeted a lot of the minorities recently. Of course, that's now spilling out into the diaspora, and we've seen various manifestations of that in different forms. Do you think, why do you think the Sikh community itself? What is it within the Sikh community and belief that differentiates them from other Indians? Do you think it's education? Do you think it's cultural? What is it?
I think it's the teachings of our faith and our way of life. So when our gurus laid down their own lives for the defense of others, for the freedom of others, the religious freedoms of others, that's been instilled in us from, in our very identity. We were given this identity so we couldn't hide away in a crowd. If we thought there was injustice being done, then we had a duty to speak up. And therefore, I think this is even ingrained even more in Sikhs born in the diaspora or brought up in the diaspora, because they see those freedoms around them. They also see injustices, and they do raise their voice in a whole range of campaigns. I remember when I was at university, I was heavily involved in the anti-apartheid movement. So it's not that we focus simply on our own community, but it just happens to be, in the last 40 years, a major part of my lifetime, the Sikhs have been subjected to what we say is a genocide. And what we're seeing in more recent times, and I think we're going to talk about this, is perhaps sitting in our homes, sitting in these safe places in the UK, Canada and America, all of a sudden, the long arms of the Indian government or the Indian authorities seem to be reaching out, and they've resorted to what we can only term assassinations or plots to kill people.
And of course, standing up for any cause is by its very nature going to create enemies. And it has been very apparent, certainly as I've learnt, that the Sikh community are not afraid to stand up for the rights of all sorts of minorities. And that has made enemies. And of course, any authoritarian regime who doesn't like that is going to fight back, is going to hit back quite viciously, as we've seen. So, of course, transnational repression, this is a term, I guess, coined by the US government, it seems. But transnational repression does seem real. It does seem to be happening. In your view, how are you seeing it from your perspective and in your community? Of course, transnational repression takes many forms. How are you seeing it? Obviously, there's the very high-profile elements of it, which have hit international news. But at a lower level, are you seeing any more subtle manifestations of transnational repression?
I think, Angus, this is a fascinating question, because it's probably only in the last 12 months, or even less than 12 months, we've been talking about transnational repression. And it made me think, and I'm writing something up about transnational repression. And actually, the place to probably start is actually say, well, is transnational repression new? And the answer, as far as Sikhs in Britain are concerned, is absolutely not. So if I could go back to the events of June 1984, is the Sikh Federation published a report called Sacrificing Sikhs in November 2017. And this was based upon UK government papers, nothing to do with what the Sikh community is, but UK government papers released under the 30-year rule. And I'm just going to give you two examples from June 1984. So on the 7th of June 1984, this was a telegram sent by Geoffrey Howe, who was the Foreign Secretary, to the British High Commissioner in Delhi. He said, on the afternoon of the 7th of June, the Indian High Commissioner in London went to see Douglas Hurd. Douglas Hurd, who obviously went on to become Home Secretary, was a Home Office Minister in June 1984. And what he said to Douglas Hurd was, could they put into detention UK Sikh leaders? And the reason why he was asking was the Indian Army had just carried out an assault on the Golden Temple complex. It sealed Punjab. They were going from village to village. And Sikhs in the UK decided to hold the very first protest on the 10th of June 1984. So on the 7th of June, the Indian High Commissioner is named. Douglas Hurd is named. He says, can you arrest Sikh leaders? And Douglas Hurd's reaction, this is Geoffrey Howe saying this in writing, was he wasn't really keen on internment, because that's what it would be called. But he still entertained the fact that the Indian High Commissioner gave him a list of Sikh leaders. This list went to Special Branch, and Special Branch came back and said, you can't arrest these people. They're the presidents of UK Gurdwaras. Now, that was on the 7th of June 1984. You can carry out atrocities in Amritsar and Punjab, but actually those long arms of India were reaching out to the UK government saying, can't you arrest people here so they don't protest? And then the second example, the following day, on the 8th of June, India's Foreign Secretary at the time went to see the British High Commissioner, again, a minuted meeting on the 8th of June 1984. And he says, we're concerned about the security of the Indian High Commissioner in London with this protest on the 10th of June. And he went on to say, and this is chilling because this is in black and white, he went on to say, we just had a protest outside the Bangladeshi embassy in Delhi, and we shot dead 2 protesters. And the clear implication was, could the British shoot Sikh protesters in London on the 10th of June 1984? And I think we often forget that transnational repression by the Indian government influencing other governments actually has been going on for at least 40 years. And if I fast forward to what we've just seen with the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, the mysterious death of Tarsin Kunda, and the plot for America, I think that's just simply been brought home to the masses. The masses probably weren't thinking about what was happening in 1984 because the papers didn't get released for 30 years. But actually, when you see things in black and white, you just think, what were these governments doing? Now, on the one hand, at least, Douglas Hurd, Special Branch didn't act upon the requests of the Indian authorities. But actually, it's the mindset of the Foreign Secretary, the Indian High Commissioner in London, that they could have the audacity to say, look, we may send the tanks into the Golden Temple and kill people and kill pilgrims, but we want you to stop protesters in London. And I think that transnational repression has reared its head in the last 40 years at various times. And if I just give you 2 examples from Britain, in 2001, March 2001, and this very much explains how I got into activism in a very much big way. In March 2001, the UK government, under anti-terror legislation, decides to ban 2 Sikh organisations. Now, because we're talking about the post 9/11 era, this wasn't post 9/11, this was pre 9/11. This was March 2001. And the immediate reaction of UK politicians was, hold on a minute, why is the UK government banning Sikh organisations in the UK, and the UK alone? No Sikh organisations are banned in India, in America, in Canada. Why was it happening in the UK? And I would very much say this was down to the Indian government applying pressure on the then government, which is a Labour government, and saying, look, can't you do something to silence these people? And on top of that, the Indian government itself has documented that the armed insurgency in Punjab by Sikhs, they killed off in about 1992. So almost a decade later, they were turning their attention to Sikh activists in the UK. Now, you may say, this is what governments do, but the issue is the government, that is my government, the UK government, I'm a British citizen, I was born here, like more than 70% of Sikhs that live in the UK. There are 2nd and 3rd generation Sikhs here. We regard ourselves as British, and we expect our government to protect our rights and our freedoms. And I think that's why transnational repression of what's been going on and the international focus there's been in the last probably 6 or 7 months since Justin Trudeau stood up in Parliament has meant there are more and more people not just asking questions about what's happening now, but what's happened in the past. And the issue of Khalistan, which we do need to talk about, there is a very close association with Britain in terms of the Sikh Empire, the Anglo-Sikh Wars. And actually, what we found talking to a range of mainstream media people is people are genuinely interested in that Sikh history, that experience with the British, promises that were made, promises made by those in India, and then what's happened since 1947. So actually, the transnational repression has opened up a can of worms for India. So by taking the life of Deep Singh Nijjar and maybe others, what it's done is it's opened up a much wider debate about what is happening in India. Why are minorities under threat? And I think given elections in India, in the US, in Canada, in the UK, this has become a real live issue that governments cannot ignore.
Yeah, and it's an interesting history because I think you've alluded to the evolution of transnational repression. It seems to have evolved and morphed from basically just straightforward old-fashioned oppression of the Sikh community within the Punjab going back historically, certainly since partition. The word that you used there that's been widely bandied around is this word terrorist, and it's a very cynical technique of India that they've seemed to have evolved from straightforward old-fashioned oppression within the Punjab to now tracking down people in the community who have the courage to stand up and say, you can't do this, and treating them and calling them as terrorists. And of course, by doing that, certainly domestically in India, it allows the Indian government to use all sorts of fairly nefarious legislation to detain them without normal due process. But of course, it appears, and as you've also mentioned, the Western governments are now being approached and pressured by the Indian government to say, look, the West, you've got this huge anti-terrorist move in process at the moment after 9/11, etc. And the Indian government are now leveraging the Western mindset of this very strongly anti-terrorist mindset that's prevailing in the West. They're saying, okay, you are harbouring our terrorists. In Canada, in the UK, and the US, why don't you please detain those people or repatriate them to India? Because they are terrorists. Do you think that is a cynical ploy? Do you think it's a genuine feeling by the Indian government? Where does terrorism come into this? Are there Khalistani terrorists?
I think, Angus, the other word I'd add with terrorists is extremist. And what we say is this demonization. If there's anyone in the UK, Canada, America, where the Indian government have evidence that those individuals could be prosecuted because of what they've done in India, then they should be presenting that to the respective governments and calling for their extradition. That's basically rule of law, that you can't take the law into your own hands. But people like myself, I've been to India twice, once when I was 5 and once in 1996. I raised my voice. Now, they will probably label me a terrorist or an extremist or a militant in these phrases simply to demonize me. Now, that's where we expect our own governments to be stronger, to recognize, why is it people like me are talking about not the creation of a Sikh homeland, but the re-establishment of a Sikh homeland. And actually, I can go into political circles and I can talk to politicians of all political persuasion, and they find it very difficult to disagree with our history. Our history was that we had a Sikh kingdom for over 50 years. We had the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and actually, it's what happened after the Anglo-Sikh Wars for almost 100 years. So the first time where Britain and this is very much a Britain-based discussion, when Britain needed the Sikhs, when we had the Indian Army mutiny in 1857, it was the Sikhs that came to Britain's help. And we often talk about those turban-wearing Sikhs that sacrificed their lives in the First World War and the Second World War. But in between, and it's just ironic that when we're recording this program, this is marking an era when you go back 100 years, we mark the end of the First World War. But what did we get straight after the end of the First World War? We got the massacre by the British in Amritsar, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Now, if you think about it, here were people sacrificing their lives for the freedoms we enjoy in Europe. And what you did to suppress protesters, and this was the British, they were shooting unarmed protesters simply for gathering. And then in February, in 2021, and in 1921 and 1924, almost 100 years ago, we had the massacre at Nankana Sahib, the birthplace of the first Sikh Guru, and exactly 100 years ago, there was something called Jetoda Morcha. These were Sikhs protesting, and they were shot dead on the 21st of February 1924. And when you talk about the sacrifices Sikhs made, not just for Britain, but in the independence struggle, then the next thing, which is never really talked about in Britain, is why did Clement Attlee, a Labour Prime Minister, offer the Sikhs their own homeland in 1947? Very little is written about this. Very little is released in the public domain. But the point is, it was based upon that 100 years of history. And therefore, when I look a British politician in the face and say, this is not something new, there's history behind this, and the fact that the Sikhs threw their lot in with at the time Congress in India, and the broken promises, the Indian constitution not recognizing Sikhs, that's been our experience since 1947. And obviously the more recent experience over the last 40 years is such that I think very few politicians can argue about the way the Indian authorities have treated us, have killed us, have suppressed our voices, and they're doing this abroad. And I think it's only a matter of time before governments realise that the current Modi regime, which is probably going to win the elections in a few months' time, is very much, and I think you've talked about this on your shows, it's no longer a democracy, it's an autocracy. Opponents of the government, whether they be political parties, journalists, human rights groups, you name it, they have been suppressed. And therefore, governments have to think longer term. What is the direction of travel under a one-party state in India? What is going to happen to the minorities there? And also, what sort of threat does it pose on their own soil? Which is, I think, the issue that's really come up in the last 6 to 9 months, is has India overstepped a mark whereby, if they carry out assassinations or plots, that's one thing. And I think you did ask me this earlier, and I should probably cover that, is transnational repression. At one end of the spectrum is assassinations and plots to kill people. But at the other end of the spectrum, it's been blacklists. It's not giving you a visa. It's taking away your OCI card. And in more recent times, it's targeting Sikh activists on social media. It's targeting protesters in the West by taking their photographs and then sharing them on social media. This is all a form of transnational repression, which I think governments are only now coming round to recognise, but only governments that recognise it and then push back with India will actually be successful. And that's not the impression we get in the UK. We get the feeling in Canada and America, they have been pushing back privately and publicly. In Britain, we're not sure what they're doing privately, but they're virtually doing zero when it comes publicly. So I think, Angus, what we've experienced in the last decade is a number of examples, starting off with the dossier that Modi gave to Cameron in 2015 in his first UK visit as a Prime Minister. We've then had the abduction, torture and arbitrary detention of Jagtar Singh Johal since November 2017, a British national. And then we've had raids, we've had attempted extraditions, and obviously more recently is this whole thing of how do you target not just prominent Sikhs that are perhaps activists, but people that just turn up to a protest, people that travel to India, and they are going to extreme lengths to try and say, look, 40 years after 1984, these Sikhs abroad still are raising their voices despite what's taken place. And I think, Angus, we've got the farmers' protest happening at the moment. And I've reflected on a number of media channels that if you go back to 2020, when the farmers' protest started, it was probably the first example, mass protest, 215 million people. And it wasn't just Sikhs, it was farmers across India, very much with a prominent, presence of Sikhs from Punjab. And what we saw was the likes of Rihanna, Greta Thunberg, people just tweeting about it. And we saw, the trolls from India target them, burn their effigies in Delhi, simply for putting out a one-liner tweet supporting farmers. And what that did, in that more than a year campaign, was the first time Narendra Modi in November 21 had to take a step back and take back those 3 farm laws. And a lot of governments would have noted that Narendra Modi may have created an autocracy, but he took on a group called the farmers, which cut across political divisions, cut across faiths, and they stood up to Modi, and Modi had to take back those laws. But he took back the laws, he announced them on the day of the Gurpurb of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, because he realised the prominence of Sikhs in this. And we've seen examples from 2020-21, the likes of Deep Sidhu, Sidhu Moosewala. We've seen these people come to prominence. Bhai Amritpal Singh, who has been in prison now for almost a year. The Indian authorities often talk about these people calling for Sikh independence are very much people abroad. But actually, all those examples I've just given and those people are all from India. And therefore, that has worried them. And on top of that, they've realised the role of the diaspora in the farmers' protest in 2021 was massive. Financially, going there, visiting them, given that moral support as well, that publicity internationally, the motions we had in the UK Parliament, the debates we had in the UK Parliament, and I'm just talking about UK, this was a global phenomenon. That is something that I think Narendra Modi and Ajit Doval, his right-hand man, the so-called James Bond of India, has probably thought, we need to do something about this. And I think that explains why they've resorted to something that would have been unheard of deciding to take the law into their own hands, because the information we're picking up from Canada is not the official line the Indian government give about this is absurd, this is ridiculous. It's more what the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and the head of intelligence has been saying is they've never denied it. They start cooperating, and if they are cooperating, then they go into denial again. But actually, it's only a matter of time, and I think the Americans have that information, which will emerge, that shows the Indian government were directly involved. And I think this is a crossroads for the Modi regime. If they continue with their attitude of denial and thinking they can take the law into their own hands, then I think global powers have a responsibility to their citizens and also to the wider world and actually the people of India, because it's the people of India that ultimately suffer, the minorities, women, a whole range of groups that get targeted at various times by those that really want to move to an extreme right-wing philosophy, and that's what they want to do. I think it's a really interesting challenge that faces not only India, but actually those governments and countries that want to work with India, but find perhaps they can't be trusted.
Yeah, and yet, and this is a real contradiction that I find with the British government, and again, you've talked about this to some extent, is that, as you've said, you talk to politicians, it's a very easy sell, the whole Sikh story, because of the history, and there is a clear-cut case for Khalistan based on the history. And yet, despite knowing all this, knowing that India does not share our values, on many levels it does not share our values, and we talked about, is it even a democracy? And yet, despite all this, we see, and we have seen over decades, potentially, every British successive government has not stood up for what is right. We've seen back in 1984, we've seen the British government actually lending surreptitious support to Indira Gandhi with the genocide and the attack on the Golden Temple, all the way through to, as you said, the dossier handed to Cameron in 2015. And now we've got transnational repression, which is it's so obvious that there's almost no denying it. And yet we've got a British Prime Minister who's shaking the hands of Narendra Modi, and I hear silence. I'm not hearing condemnation. Every time that the Sikh community approach the government or any representative of the government, they're met with a brick wall. They're met with epithets, they're met with euphemisms, they're met with pretty language. I think it was Tan Desi in Parliament raised the question, and I think it was Penny Mordaunt gave a very anodyne, a very diplomatic, a very non-answer, political answer, let's call it, which basically said nothing. So why are we seeing the British government, in contrast to the US and the Canadian governments, why are they silent about what's going on?
I think this falls into two things. One is that history, because if you've been a colonial power, which Britain were in India, I mentioned some of those atrocities carried out, Jallianwala Bagh, what happened in Kana Sahib, what happened 100 years ago, almost to the day in Jaitul Morcha. These are things, if you think about it, if they were happening today, the world would be condemning it, saying how can a power just fire on innocent people or people that were protesting, shoot them dead. That's what, unfortunately, Britain's history was. And what India's done since 1947 has successfully almost totally silenced all public criticism by any British government since. It doesn't matter which political parties come into power. Now, what we're saying is, well, I was born here, like many other Sikhs. This is our government. The politicians of today aren't responsible for what happened before 1947. We live here now in the present, and we want you to raise our voices about what's happening now and what's happened in the recent past. And the best example I can give you actually is of David Cameron and of William Hague, who were the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary in 2014 when those papers broke about what Margaret Thatcher did in 1984. And because we had a number of connections in Downing Street, the message we got back, they were shocked, they were horrified. They didn't know that's what the Conservative government in 1984 were doing. So the likes of Geoffrey Howe, Douglas Hurd, they knew about it. But a new generation of politicians didn't know about that, and they were quite alarmed. But nonetheless, they resorted to damage limitation, cover-up. And what will be really interesting in the months and years that follow is the Labour Party, the opposition party, which, if you believe the opinion polls, is likely to come to power at the next general election. Well, they have promised in election manifestos that they will have an independent public inquiry into the events of 1984. What was the role of the UK government? And I gave you two very chilling examples of what happened on the 7th and 8th of June, and that is the tip of the iceberg. This is based on papers that have emerged. What about all the papers that didn't emerge? And I think a lot of Labour politicians have said it can't simply focus on what did the UK government do to assist Indira Gandhi. It's also got to focus on what did the UK government do to British Sikhs at that time, because enough evidence has emerged how, although Special Branch might have said we can't arrest these Sikh leaders, the increased surveillance that took place, the intelligence sharing that took place, all started back in 1984. And that came out to play when Jagtal was arrested, when he was tortured, because photographs were put in front of Jagtal Singh Johal of people we've literally seen killed in the last 12 months. And that means there is this bigger issue for Britain. It's not only that historic past, I think they've got a lot to hide of how what they've done to a minority in Britain, a minority that's got a fantastic reputation and a history of standing loyal with the British, of how they've actually looked at wider interests, wider political interests. And obviously you can't get away from the current government's position on a trade deal, the dire position they're in, having a prime minister who says, I'm a proud Hindu, that's his words. These are things that do get played out in our community where they just think, can Rishi Sunak be trusted? And hand on my heart, I know there's lots of conservative politicians that question what the likes of Priti Patel and Rishi Sunak did and are doing, that has made the situation much worse. And therefore, we can only say any incoming government can only be better than this. But I think there will be a pressure, because there will be not just two Sikh MPs, Dabinderjit Singh OBE and Preet Kaur Gill, but actually we're confident there's almost going to be 10 Sikh Labour MPs in a future government. And I think they will raise their voices because they won't be able to ignore what a judge says from an independent public inquiry. And I think when people see those things come out in black and white, our biggest aim in the future is to ensure any future UK government has the courage and strength to call out human rights violations in India, irrespective of who's been targeted. We need a country and a government that doesn't simply say it's okay to target Russia, China, and the likes. But when it comes to some of your friends, Saudi Arabia, it's muted. Iran, it's okay. When it's India, it's almost like you just remain totally silent. And I think individual politicians agree with us, but when they seem to get into government or in opposition, in senior positions, there's something that's holding them back. And clearly one is the Indian government lobby, the pressure, they can simply pick up the phone to somebody, whereas the Sikh community are probably learning how to play that politics. But actually, I think we've come a long way, and Sikhs in Canada have done the same. In America, different situation given the population. But I just think more and more Sikhs that are born in the West, that have worked in the West, think like people in the West, I think it's only a matter of time that the ordinary public recognises Sikhs for what they are, and politicians and governments also recognise Sikhs for what they are, which is actually freedom-loving people that stand up for everyone's rights. And actually, we have a duty and almost a commitment to stand with them. And we think it's only a matter of time before that happens.
Yeah, but do you not think India has played a very shrewd game here? They played actually a game echoed by China, which is to use subtle infiltration, let's call it, into key elements of society across the West. They've used money and they've used political subversive powers, let's say. In other words, my question to you, do you think that India has somehow infiltrated recently or even over the longer term British politics? We've mentioned obviously Rishi Sunak is a practicing Hindu, so there is obviously a question there. But within the establishment itself, and there does seem to be, and this is an interesting division that you've mentioned here, that there is the government and there is the establishment. And those with great intentions come into government, suddenly they're aligned with the establishment. We've seen this not just with the Sikh community, we've seen this in all sorts of different other completely unrelated issues. But particularly with this, do you think there is something going on behind the scenes that has occurred over many years where India has slowly but surely influenced the political agenda in this country?
I think it goes further, Angus. We've just seen in Canada how they're looking into interference in the federal elections, and clearly India has now been named in the terms of reference about the last two federal elections in Canada. And now, when that came out in the public domain, an Indian spokesperson gave an interview where he said, "We absolutely deny that we've interfered in the elections, not only in Canada, but in any democratic country. And what we did is we shared two things." So The Guardian in January 2024 wrote an article about the Indian vote. And what they said in there, at the last general election in 2019, the BJP openly campaigned for over 40 Conservative candidates. And what we shared alongside that was an article from the Times of India, which said the BJP said they themselves campaigned for 48 Conservative MPs in the last general election. Now, what we've said directly and indirectly to Tom Tugendhat, the Security Minister, is this country introduced new legislation in July 23, the National Security Act, that makes that illegal. And it was really funny to see the reaction of the trolls from India, because our social media accounts are banned in India. So these trolls actually are probably living in the UK. And they started saying, well, don't Sikhs interfere? And don't they say something about who to vote for in elections in India? I think they completely missed the point. Individuals are free to do that, but political parties and the party in government shouldn't be allowed to do that, and it's illegal in the UK. So this is one of the things that we have raised with Tom Tugendhat. He's got a Defending Democracy task force. So alongside, these various extremist task forces, which get a lot of publicity in India, there is another task force which is about how do you defend a democracy. And what we're saying is there is plenty of evidence from the UK, obviously Canada's got their own investigation, that the BJP openly supported Conservative candidates. It could be Labour candidates. We don't really care. We're just saying that's what they did. Now, I am sure politicians of all political parties in this country, they are fully aware of what happened to people like Dabinderjit Singh OBE, where the BJP ran a campaign locally against him, putting up a Indian candidate with BJP backing. That was played out. But the point is our government strong enough to say we must defend our democratic values in this country, and therefore we will push back to the BJP and say you are not allowed to. This is criminal activity if you do this. And I think only time will tell. But the cat's out the bag. They did it last time. We will have a general election. And I think the BJP and the Indian government are stupid enough to probably do it again. And then I think if we have an incoming Labour government and the BJP have backed Conservatives, I think we will see some quite big changes.
Well, here's a question, and it concerns me because all this is very, I would almost use the word ideological. It's hopeful, it's optimistic, it's aspirational, but the facts on the ground, and let's use Avtar Singh Kandar's situation as a prime example of this. We've got the establishment, and we've got this complex relationship between India and the UK government. It's very clear that Avtar's death was highly suspicious. It's also become clear subsequently that the West Midlands Police did not go through normal investigative protocols to see what actually happened, obviously in the context of transnational repression. And there's been this passing of the buck between the coroner and between the police force. Basically, the family have hit a brick wall of the establishment, who essentially are putting every obstacle in the way to prevent a genuine investigation happening. Why? What's going on here? Despite all these hopes that the government will change, that the establishment is not changing. There are these brick walls. How can we overcome this establishment brick wall?
Angus, this highlights a wider issue that everything you said is absolutely true about Avtar Singh Kandar, his mysterious death, what the West Midlands Police have done, what the coroner's done. But actually, if you look at the bigger picture was, in Canada, the Canadian authorities were talking to their counterparts, and we didn't know about it. None of us knew about it until Justin Trudeau stood up. But why did Justin Trudeau stand up? Because the media, the Globe and Mail, had been talking to Canadian intelligence, and they told Trudeau's office they were going to break the news. The same happened in the US. The FT broke the news a week before the indictment was unsealed. Now, the reason why I mention that, with Avtar Singh Kandar, it's fascinating because the facts are he was receiving death threats. The facts are his death was deemed mysterious. The facts are the next of kin reported it to the police. The facts are the police sealed his body within 24 hours, ready for an autopsy. The National Crime Agency were involved. Now, the West Midlands Police, and again, it's journalists that have really been pursuing this, they have established that basically the West Midlands Police did not do their job, and nor did the coroner. So Michael Pollack, who is the barrister acting for the family, he's pushing not just for an inquest to be opened up into Avtar Singh Kandar's death, but right from the outset, on the 2nd of October, when he did a press conference, and we were there, he said, I'm asking for a high court judge or a retired high court judge to be appointed, because I think this inquest will become an inquiry, and it's only in an inquiry will the intelligence be opened up. And the reason why I was saying that, and I've said this many times, and I'll happily share it on Satluj television, when Justin Trudeau stood up in Parliament on the 18th of September, and that press conference that Michael Pollack held on the 2nd of October, several different sources came to us, or came to Michael Pollack, or came to journalists, national journalists, and all the sources were British intelligence sources. And in a nutshell, what they were saying was, there is foul play. So what we had in the UK, within about a 2-week spell, is British intelligence officers started to talk to journalists, to lawyers, to the community, and saying something's not right. And that makes complete sense in terms of why the West Midlands Police changed from being very serious about something to then covering it up and the coroner not doing anything. And I think this is one of the things that journalists, international journalists, have been doing, some based here, some based in India, some based in America, is, I know I spoke to somebody from the Washington Post yesterday that were in Ottawa. They will in the coming days be releasing quite a lot of information about who the person was that was directing affairs from Delhi, which is in the public domain. They almost certainly with the Five Eyes nations intelligence gathering and sharing mechanism, I think they will be picking up things from the American intelligence and Canadian intelligence about Tharsin Kunda. And I think that's why the UK authorities need to think this is not going to go away. The community is not going to let this go. Journalists are not going to let this go because they generally smell a rat here. Something is not right.
Well, we know for a start.
What we've experienced since the 2nd of October.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. We know for a start that threat to life notices have been issued to several people in the community. So it's clearly ongoing, and clearly intelligence services know there is something going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, and it's not just threat to life. You know, when in the last 2 weeks we've seen, whether it be BBC Newsnight or Sky News, major television outlets that are running stories about people that have been on a hit list. And the point about that hit list, and it was one of the journalists actually from the BBC when they came to interview, said, well, look, this was an Indian television broadcast, but it was a broadcast in Britain, you know, on satellite television. Therefore, Ofcom have a responsibility. Now, I know categorically that was on the 10th of July, 2023, when they put up the images of 20 Sikhs in different countries, 6 from the UK. But they also then, in that, said the National Investigation Agency's hit list, that's how they described it. They also say, and they took responsibility for, and they showed the picture of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, Tharsin Kunda, Gurwardhan Singh Pannu, and somebody called Banji Singh Banjwar, who was killed on the 6th of May in Pakistan. Actually, they were admitting on television, broadcast here, that they had killed these people. Now, the reason why I say I think things have been happening behind the scenes in Britain is the person that was featured on Sky News, he lives in Wolverhampton. His Member of Parliament is Pat McFadden, someone who's in the shadow cabinet, has been a former minister under Tony Blair. And therefore, I saw the letters that Pat McFadden wrote to the Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary last July about that hit list on that channel broadcast in the UK. And I am certain the UK government took that information and the information counter-terror police were saying about some of the repressive activities of the NEI in the UK by putting photographs of protesters on social media and video footage. We are certain around about the end of July, Britain quietly raised this with the Indian authorities. And the reason why we say this is on the 1st of August, the National Investigation Agency of India raided the homes of around 50 UK Sikhs in India and Punjab. The chair of the Sikh Federation, a 74-year-old, the vice chair, they weren't even involved in that protest on the 19th of March where the Indian flag was lowered. But their homes were raided. 7 hours the police was there. Their family members were summoned to Delhi on the 3rd and 7th of August. And what they did was they showed them the 45 photographs of the protesters from the 19th of March and said, are your family members here? And they said, of course they're not. You know they're not. They're well-known individuals that weren't there. You have the photographs of the people. You know what they look like. That was sheer intimidation. Now, that is a form of transnational repression. We think that was a tit for tat by India to Britain because Britain, in the summer, then expelled a raw agent from London, which Britain doesn't deny, but India haven't said a word. Normally, India would be up in arms because I think potentially Tharsin Kunda, potentially what the NIA were doing here, what the NIA were doing in India, that hit list, taking responsibility. If you add it all together, it's like joining up the dots and say, actually, there's something not right here. That's what international journalists have really picked up on.
Do you think things will change with a potential new government later this year?
I think things will get better, but we shouldn't underestimate the Indian government using its influence over any government, over any politicians, and we will never have the vote bank or the say. But the one thing we have got, Angus, and I'm sure you picked this up in your many interviews with Sikhs, is we have the truth. And ultimately, our faith is about the truth prevailing. And therefore, I think we're on a journey, we're on a struggle. And actually, in that struggle, Sikhs always excel. And no one should underestimate our willpower to ultimately expose the truth.
A perfect way to finish the interview. Dabinderjit Singh, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
You've been watching Satluj TV News Special. I'm Angus Scott in London.